Hello everyone, AmyR here with Prairie Paper and Ink, and today I have a card set for you guys using the new Hutson Leading Lady Crafty Lady stamp set. So I used the main image from this set and I am inking it up with Hero Art's Intense Black ink and stamping it onto some Bristol smooth cardstock here, and decided to stamp it multiple times because I thought it would be fun to kind of experiment using different color combos. Anyone who's been following me for a long time knows I love people images, especially when there's enough space on the clothing and that. You can do paper piecing and different patterns and that sort of thing. So I stamped this multiple times, and then I'm using my Tombow markers to color this in, keeping the coloring really, really simple. So for this first one, I'm just doing a really pale skin tone. So I only used the one marker at first, and then I had to deepen it a little bit because it's so pale that you can barely see anything. So added a little bit more color to that. And then I pulled out a really light pink just to add a little bit of definition to her cheeks and to her lips. So I'm just adding the color with the marker first, and then I'm just using a water brush to pull that color out and kind of smooth everything together. And with the cheeks, I just really lightly dab the color on so that it's not too overwhelming. And then for her hair, I'm just using a yellow marker, scribbling some of the color on, pulling that out with my water brush. I'm really liking this Bristol smooth cardstock. If you're not too heavy-handed with water, you can get some really nice like watercolor effects without warping the cardstock. You just kind of need to watch, and that's where I like the water brush usually, because I can just dab off the water brush in between colors, as well as if it gets a little too wet, I can just dab it off, dry off the brush a little bit, and then keep going. So I will have all the colors that I used listed. I'll list them in my blog post, because usually with the Tombow markers, I don't pay attention to the colors I used. This time I did, so I did write down the color numbers. I think there's names for Tombow markers, but I'm not even sure because it's not on the markers themselves. So I'm not, I don't use these often enough and haven't had them long enough to know like all the colors off by hand, but I will share the color combos I did for each of these little characters on my blog. So I just went along and I did my standard, MO, did the skin tone first and then would finish with their hair. So I just started like experimenting and pulling out random colors and just doing different colors for skin tones, doing different colors of hair. I really like this image because it's an easy one to color and you can make it look completely different just depending on which colors you choose or what coloring methods you'd like to do. These look really cute coloring with COPICs, or you could use Zig Clean Color Real brush markers, or you could use colored pencils, like anything would be fun with these. So this time I used the Tombow markers, but I think next time I use these, I'm probably going to experiment and try like using my Zigs or maybe my COPIC markers. So once I get to my last one here, this is the one I did with the deepest skin tone. So pulling that color out and then adding, I used a much deeper pink so that it would show up against the darker skin tone. And same thing, I'm dabbing off my water brush kind of in between, because as I was adding water, like that pink was really starting to spread and I didn't want it to cover everything. So dab that off a little bit and then finished off the skin tone, and then I'm gonna go on and finish her hair. I purposely left the clothes on these blank because I plan on doing some paper piecing. I wasn't sure as I was coloring whether I was gonna do paper piece their entire outfits or just part of their outfits, but as I got closer to finishing these, I ended up deciding that I was going to color in all of their pants just to make my life a little bit simpler so I didn't have to do too much paper piecing. Plus with the patterns I was planning on using for their shirts, I knew that they were going to be fairly busy. So once I'm done all the watercoloring for their skin and hair, I just used the same blue marker for all of their pants. Again, simple is best. So just scribbling on the marker and then pulling it out with my water brush. So I did all of those images with that. And then I used just a pale purple marker to do their shoes. So then once I'm done with all of my coloring, I can trim down this piece and then I'll be doing all of my paper piecing and die cutting and all that fun stuff. So I just wanted to get all the coloring done. And then for the patterns for their shirts, I'm using my favorite things. I'm using the proper Pinstripes Pastels paper as well as the Itsy Bitsy Polka Dots Pastels paper. So just kind of random color combos from these paper packs. And I'm just inking up the stamp with that same Intense Black ink and only inking up the shirt area, stamping it onto the pattern paper, and I'm going to first just trim this out with scissors and then set it aside. So I'm going to stamp this 4 times onto 4 different colors of pattern paper. And then I'm going to do the same thing on a different pattern paper onto the pinstripe paper. So altogether, I'm going to have 8 little stamped images here. So I'm just trimming these out with my scissors, and then I'm going to go onto the pinstripes and do the exact same thing. So just choosing which colors I wanted to use to go with the little polka dot patterns here. So inking up my stamp, I'm just stamping them on the lower corners here so I'm not wasting as much pattern paper, and then I can trim that off with my scissors. And then I've got my little ensembles for all these little characters. So getting everything stamped and then figuring out which color I want to go with which. And that's also why I chose these little MFT paper packs, because the colors coordinate so nicely. So it just made my life a little bit easier, so I didn't have to go through my massive amounts of pattern paper, because anyone, again, who has watched my videos know I tend to hoard pattern paper. So once I've got everything stamped, now I'm going to start doing the actual paper piecing part of this. So I am trimming out with the polka dots, I'm trimming out this little center area that is just her little shirt. Just trimming these out with really sharp detail scissors and making sure to trim basically just along the line. And looking back on this video, what I could have done with the stripe piece is I could have just trimmed this into one piece and left that center area, because I'm going to adhere over it anyway. But I wasn't thinking that, but as always, hindsight's 20/20. So if I was to redo this, I wouldn't bother cutting these into 2 pieces like this. I would have just trimmed out as one. It would have been faster and easier. But for all of these, I ended up trimming, like I show, into 2 pieces, just trimming out the little cardigan area here. So again, trimming it out with my detail cutting scissors and cutting right along the line. So I do that with all of these pieces of pattern paper. And then once I've got everything completely trimmed out, I'm going to pull out my Memento Tuxedo black marker, and just using the side of the brush tip of the marker, I'm going to run this really lightly along all of the edges of all these pieces of pattern paper. That's going to cover up any little areas where I didn't trim perfectly. It's going to give it that black edge so that everything looks seamless, so that when you adhere this over your stamped image, it all looks perfect. So just very lightly, you don't want to hold your marker against the paper for too long, because it'll start wicking the color from the marker and you're going to end up with like blurry and smeared edges. So really lightly go across these really quickly. It doesn't take very long at all. Got all of these edged up, and then I can start adhering them to all my little characters here. So I'm going to use my Nuvo Deluxe adhesive for this. I love this. Back in the day, I used to always use my Tombow monomalty to adhere all my paper pieced images, but I prefer this Nuvo adhesive to that, hands down, because this, if it does ooze out at all, it dries fully, whereas the Tombow dries and leaves that tacky residue. So this one works a lot better. So I started by I would adhere the center area first, her little shirt, and then I'm adhering the cardigan, because if any parts of the paper need to like overlap a little bit, it just looks better. So adding really thin amounts of adhesive. If any little bits ooze out, I just pick it up with my finger like I'm doing right here, so that I don't have, blobs of adhesive anywhere. And then I'm going to super speed up this part of the video, because I'm just doing the same thing over and over again, just adhering all of their little shirts and cardigans, so they've got all their little ensembles. And then once I'm done getting everything adhered, I'm going to trim this out of the paper, and then I'm going to cut these into separate pieces so that I can use the coordinating die set. There is a Crafty Ladies, Leading Lady Crafty Lady die set. I'll have links to all the supplies I use in the description box below the video. But there is an outline die for this image, which just makes everything so much simpler. So I quickly trim this out with scissors, and then cut it into individual pieces, and then I'm going to use some micropore tape to hold that die into place, and then run these through my Big Shot to trim all of them out. And then once I've got everything trimmed out, I pulled out one of my COPIC markers. I'm using the W3 marker here, and just adding some shading to all of these pattern paper pieces. It just helps to make everything look a little more seamless and not so flat. So I'm just adding that W3 marker to like the lower areas of the shirt and, underneath the edges of the cardigan and the sleeves and whatnot, and just really completes the look when it comes to paper piecing. So it's been a long time. I used to do this all the time in my videos, and I can't even remember the last time I did any paper piecing, but it was fun doing it with these ones. So got all my shading done so I can go on and start creating the rest of my cards. So I've got some white cardstock here that I have trimmed down to just slightly smaller than an A2 card front. And I lined up all of these little smaller images from that Crafty Lady stamp set, and then I'm stamping them in Distress Oxide ink. And I'm just going to create like a patterned background with this. So for my first one, I'm using Fossilized Amber. and just moving the stamp around and adjusting it so I can completely stamp this entire background with all of these little images. There's like, you know, a pencil, a brush, a glue gun, even a little ATG adhesive gun and scissors and all that. Like, the set is so adorable. So stamp that multiple times, and then all the ink I got all over my craft mat, I'm just going to wipe it off with a baby wipe. And then I'm going to go on and do all the other pieces with different colors of Distress Oxide ink. So the first one was Fossilized Amber. The second one I used Worn Lipstick. And then I'm going to go on and use Cracked Pistachio and then Spice Marmalade. So just cleaning everything off in between colors here. And again, using baby wipes because these are pigment inks. So they kind of tend to get just everywhere. But that's why I like using baby wipes, because it just cleans up everything really, really easily. And again, I will link to the ones I prefer. I like the Costco brand ones because they don't leave little fibers and residue over your stamps or anything like that. These are the best baby wipes. I go through, I don't even know, cases of them. So then I decided to trim down some vellum so that I could stamp my sentiment, because I wanted to kind of soften the look of the backgrounds I'd stamped, and I wanted the sentiment and my little characters to pop. So I trimmed down the vellum to just slightly smaller than those backgrounds, and then I'm stamping sentiments from both the Crafty Ladies stamp set, and there's also a Crafty Ladies Say stamp set that has a bunch of fun sentiments. So I'm stamping these sentiments with some VersaMark ink onto these pieces of vellum, and then using Wow Primary Ebony embossing powder for all of this. And of course my anti-static powder tool. So using my anti-static powder tool, then inking up the stamps, and then using my embossing powder, and then melting that with my heat tool. And then with this final one, I wanted to use this large high five to that sentiment, but there was no way that was going to fit on this card with that character unless I wanted to like push her right off the edge, and I didn't want to trim them down. So instead I decided to just trim that stamp down. So I just cut apart the bottom area of the stamp, and then cut that off, and then cut apart the two words there. You can always butt these back up together to reuse like as it was intended, but I find it's just easier half the time rather than like messing around with trying to mask off areas or tape your stamps or anything like that. Might as well just cut them apart. I'm going to get more use out of them, and yeah, once you do it a couple times, it's not as bad, trust me. I know a lot of people freak out when they see me cut apart stamps, but they still work. It's all good. So cut them apart, line them up onto my stamp press here, and then I can stamp this final one onto the vellum, and then pour on that black embossing powder, and then melt that with my heat tool. And I have said this before in videos, I much prefer, especially in vellum, I much prefer using just black embossing powder rather than stamping with a black ink and embossing with clear. I find the black embossing powder gives a much more vibrant result, even though it's a pain to work with and makes a mess, which I did here. I poured some onto my desktop. I just found it easier to vacuum it up with my little craft vacuum that I keep here in my studio. So that especially comes in handy. I use that more for black embossing powder than I do for anything else. So once I'm done my sentiments, I can start adhering everything together. So I'm adhering all my little characters to that vellum with the Nuvo adhesive. And then I'm applying very thin amounts of the adhesive behind the embossed letters, trying to keep it right behind the embossing so that none of it's oozing out, because you can see this adhesive through vellum very easily. Plus you don't want to add too much adhesive because vellum warps easily, way easier than cardstock. So I always try to be as light-handed as possible with my adhesive. If you're too heavy-handed, the vellum will literally start to curl. So I just apply thin amounts of adhesive, adhere my character, flip it over, put the adhesive behind the character, and then apply the adhesive behind the words. With these great big sentiments, it was super easy. There's plenty of space to kind of hide the adhesive. With these smaller ones, I just had to be a lot more careful applying the adhesive, and just kind of very, very lightly kind of dabbed it behind those words so that it'll just hide all that adhesive. Then press that into place, and then I'm stacking everything up under some acrylic blocks to kind of hold everything flat while it dried onto all of these backgrounds. And I coordinated all of the backgrounds with all of their shirts. That was kind of my thought process there. So then once I'm done with all that, I'm going to go on to the card bases themselves. And I just chose white card bases for all of these cards. And my original plan was to just stamp the coordinating sentiments on the insides of the cards. But then I decided I wanted to stamp that little character a second time. So I made sure to match up the character with the backgrounds I stamped, and then stamp that on the inside of the card with that same Distress Oxide ink that I used on the front, and then stamp the sentiment in black. So then I would go on, clean my stamp, figure out which one goes with which, stamp the next little character in the next Distress Oxide ink, and then stamp the next sentiment with the black ink. So I'm using the same sentiment set, that Crafty Ladies Say stamp set, to finish off all the insides of these cards and stamp all the sentiments with that same Hero Arts Intense black ink. So once I have all of my insides stamped here, I can go on and start adhering all of the card fronts to their coordinating insides. So just making sure that I didn't mess up and adhere the wrong card front to the wrong inside of the card. So I'm just going to use that same Nuvo adhesive, just applying a thin amount around the perimeter of all these card fronts and then adhering them to their card bases. And that's going to finish off these cards. I did think about adding, some embellishments and whatnot, but decided to just let the little backgrounds kind of show through with all of these fun little sentiments and these characters. And like I said, I will have links below the video to my blog post. I'll have links to the supplies used. I'll list the colors I used for all these different characters. So you can check out the description box below the video if you're interested. And thank you all so much for watching and subscribing and thumbs upping and commenting on my videos. I really, really appreciate it. And I will see you all very soon in the next one. Bye.